Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. What do you think about fusion? That's in the news these days. And I thought, well, isn't that nice? They've made some progress. There's this long joke about how I've heard this forever, that nuclear fusion is going to be a wonderful technology, but it's 50 years ahead away from us still in the future, and it always will be. Because in fact, it has always been just a long process that never seemed to make any progress. And now there was a breakthrough the other day, and they say they made some progress. So I thought, well, how nice. Not that I cared very much, because it is still going to be another 50 years before it's practical. But then I began to hear, there's some deception going on. So today we're going to look behind the curtain and find out who's pulling the wool over our eyes, or to mix a few metaphors. Okay, I have three experts here on nuclear matters. Professor Frank von Hippel, who is a physicist and a professor, I think emeritus now, of public and international affairs at Princeton University. And in the 1980s, when he was the chairman of the Federation of American Scientists, he was partnered with Yevgeny Velikov in advising Mikhail Gorbachev. And I have to say, if there's any group of people who deserve to have a medal for ending the Cold War, Frank is one of them. And in Ottawa, or near there, is Gordon Edwards, who is also a specialist on all kinds of nuclear matters. And he is the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And Erica Simpson, who is an associate professor of international relations at Western University. And she's very interested in also nuclear matters. And I would like for Frank von Hippel to get us going by giving us his view of the inside story. What is it that we have not been told that we should know about, Frank?
Well, the emphasis has been on energy, but the research really was done for nuclear weapons design purposes. And it goes back to the 1993 and in a meeting that I was involved in, actually, when this was actually before I went into the Clinton administration, but then I was involved afterwards as well. And the issue was a nuclear weapons test ban. And we had a meeting where the weapons lab directors were insisting that they needed to do 15 more tests, which was Congress had said there would be no more testing, except that 15 more tests could be allowed if there were reasons for safety or reliability that required them. And the labs presented the tests that they wanted to do in this meeting that was called by the Secretary of Energy. And I was not convinced, and I brought along a retired weapons designer who was also not convinced. And it turned out the Secretary of Energy wasn't convinced either. It was Hazel O'Leary. And the directors saw the way the things were going, and one of them said, well, if you would give us as much money for not testing as you've been giving us for testing, we might be able to see your way. And so that was the beginning of the Science-Based Stockpile Stewardship Program. And it basically, the budgets, some billions of dollars a year were offered to the weapons labs, basically to do what they wanted. And those different labs chose different things. The weapons labs, the weapons design labs wanted supercomputers, but then in addition, they wanted other things. And what Livermore National Lab got was this national ignition facility that made the news, was it last week, I guess, or a week before. Mm-hmm. And
That's where the fusion breakthrough took place, right?
Yes, yes.
The National Ignition Facility at Livermore, which costs
Yes.
$3.5 billion to
Yes,
build. So it's the offshoot.
right.
It's an offshoot, really, of the giant complex at Lawrence Livermore.
And the purpose of it is to create fusion explosions on a miniature basis, to train weapons designers and also to test the computer codes that they've been working on. And so that was, and they've been having a hard time getting there.
You mean they've been having a hard time doing the project and getting success with it?
Basically, what they've been trying to do is create a fusion explosion with a yield of about energy yield about the yield of a hand grenade, and they've been struggling with this for decades now, and they finally got as much energy. Well, and the way they, instead of having a nuclear explosion, a fission explosion, to create huge pressures and temperatures, which is what happens in a thermonuclear explosion. What they've been doing is they built huge lasers and concentrated them down on a tiny millimeter-sized pellet of hydrogen, of deuterium, two heavy hydrogen isotopes, deuterium and tritium. And they've been trying to ignite these little pellets for decades now. And they finally got to the point where they got as much energy out of the pellet in terms of fusion energy as they put into it in terms of laser energy. And that was the breakthrough. Now to get to a power plant is an enormous extrapolation. You'd have to do this, many times a second, hundreds of times a second, and you'd have to, have lasers that would affordable lasers that would do this repeatedly, many times, hundreds of times a second, and so on. And nobody can. And in the end, whether that would compete with the other sources of energy we have is a stretch.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you could even a very simple nuclear power plant, which is what we have basically today, those can't compete with solar and wind power anymore. So whether this extravagant contraption could be gotten there is extremely unlikely. And so the question is, why did they promote this as an energy breakthrough?
But Frank, can I ask you a question? Because my understanding from all the media hype was that more energy was created, a tiny bit more than was put into it. And so that's the whole point, is that we could create unlimited, boundless energy like the sun decades from now. So the media focused on that tiny little increase, which was imperceptible and very, very expensive to create. But that was the ignition. And so that's why we're supposed to be excited, is that we've now finally created more energy. So can you explain that to our audience? How much energy was created? What is this important? The tritium, how expensive is it per gram?
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand the whole process, but maybe you could tell us how they managed to ignite something.
Well, in fact, it's maybe a factor of 1,000 away from actually producing net energy in terms of electricity out compared to electricity in, because a huge amount of electric power was required to and inefficiently converted to laser power going in, and what came out was heat, which would then you would have conversion losses, making electricity again. So
Yeah, and they'll have to use water all around the world, huge amounts of water to if they develop these sorts of reactors. I think that's what I got from Gordon Edwards, that it's going to, if this was developed, there'd be reactors around the world using massive amounts of water in a drought-stricken world.
Well, that I'm not sure about that. Certainly, fission reactors require a lot of water. The cooling is necessary. Water is necessary for cooling, but I think the word ignition is a little bit of a misnomer. It's more of a detonation than an ignition. As a matter of fact, it only lasted for like 80 nanoseconds. It was a very, very brief, really like a miniature, very tiny explosion. Now, of course, that happens in a gasoline internal combustion engine. You have a series of explosions, which gives the motive power to the car. But the idea of replicating those explosions so rapidly as to create useful power is so far away from reality that I don't think anybody would think of this as a realistic prospect in the foreseeable future. The other approach to fusion is the tokamak, which uses a electromagnetic sort of container. Like, think of it as an electromagnetic bottle, which has a plasma inside it. And if they could truly ignite that plasma, what the hope is that then they could actually get a burning that is self-sustaining, that the heat from the reaction automatically causes more fusion to occur. That's what happens in the sun. And, I really like there was a full page ad in the New York Times many, many years ago by the Fate of the Year, I think it was the Sierra Club, which said the sun is a splendid nuclear reactor, but you wouldn't want to live there. And to me, that kind of sums it up, because in fact, in order to achieve the kind of continuous power production that you would need, this particular experiment doesn't really bring us any closer to that at all. There are some scientific discoveries which have immediate effect, like, for example, discovering that when a uranium atom is split, there are extra neutrons. That has immediate implications for practicality. You can make an atomic bomb. The rest of it is engineering after that. But this breakthrough, they call it, is really, I think, more than anything else, it's a fraudulent publicity campaign to get the money flowing to fusion research. That's the main advantage it has for the fusion researchers. It is very interesting scientifically. It is no doubt an engineering accomplishment. But in terms of practical value, the main practical value is just to try and get more money out of governments.
I thought that because it was at the Lawrence Livermore laboratory, which is where Edward Teller worked, the father of hydrogen bombs, I'm more suspicious than you, Gordon. I think it's a bit of a snow job, so that we look at the money, 3.5 billion. Well, the Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos laboratories are hugely expensive, and they will create huge amounts of nuclear waste, tritium, that will be dangerous for the atmosphere and for the water. So I just looked at it even more suspiciously as a publicity ploy, although I myself last 2 weeks ago was part of the widespread cheerleading in the media. I initially actually thought, oh, wow, we've developed something great. I was so happy. And I emailed it to everyone I know. And now I feel disillusioned, like Dr. Spencer, very disillusioned.
I think we have been manipulated, and a lot of people fell for it, because you don't think that these people, you don't think that the Secretary of Energy is going to go on public airwaves and simply give a false account of what actually happened, and that's what we're seeing. I think that the scrabble for money for fusion research and even for fission research in terms of small modular reactors is impelling people to sort of misrepresent their product as a way of getting governments to invest in it and the public to support it. If the public can applaud the breakthrough, so-called breakthrough, then the government elected officials feel that they're justified in pouring more money into it. I don't know, Frank, what would you say about that, Frank?
I was shocked at what Frank said about how they reacted when being told that we're going to not allow you to do these 15 more things, and they say, well, we want the same amount of money for not doing it as for doing it. What kind of a business offer would that be, and how could you possibly get away with making such a crass kind of, just give me money, damn it? It sounds like robbery or something if you make that kind of demand. How can they get away with that kind of expectation that they'll be given money really for just doing nothing?
Well, I mean, it's not nothing because they have to maintain their skills somehow, but the leverage they had was that if they argued against the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, then it wouldn't be ratified. And they have been fighting for decades against the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and in fact they sort of they certainly didn't not endorse the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty when it came up in front of the Senate for ratification.
So it was political leverage. Okay.
They got their reward.
Now the other thing that I wondered, and I assume that there's absolutely no real risk, but when Gordon talks about how in the sun the system is self-sustaining, that is, because it ignites one thing, that is enough to get it to do the next one, etc. That's my notion of what a runaway situation would be. Well, when we hear of risks involved, safety risks for fusion, I mean, for fission, of course, but is there any real risk that a fusion process could become so self-sustaining that you couldn't stop it, or that it would be uncontrollable?
No, I think here the problem is getting it to happen rather than keeping it from running out of control. But I just wanted to mention, since we're indignant about the false advertising, that Livermore has a history of this, and here we had a gullible Secretary of Energy who grabbed onto it. Livermore was Edward Teller, who is the founding director of Livermore, not officially but actually, promoted peaceful nuclear explosions as a reason to keep nuclear testing, continuing nuclear testing. That turned out to be a fraud. Later on, Teller promoted that he had an idea for an X-ray laser that could be shot into space and shoot down multiple, maybe even 100 Soviet warheads coming in our direction, and that launched the Star Wars program, which a huge waste and which really prevented nuclear arms reductions for some time. So this is in that tradition, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful for the novices who are listening to this. The difference between fission and fusion, one of the most important differences is that fission can take place from a cold start. Like you just put the fissionable material together and boom, you have a bomb or you have a reactor if it's carefully done. With fusion, you got to get the temperature up way above 100 million degrees in order to get it going. And it has to stay at that temperature in order to continue. So that's why it's very unlikely that you would have a runaway of the type that you're talking about, Meta, which would be, not being able to control it. It's very difficult to maintain temperatures at such an extremely high level. And certainly with this, I call it like popping little kernels, which is what they did at the Lawrence lab. popping kernels is a very, very hard way to try and maintain those temperatures at such a high level. I don't think and it doesn't seem to be feasible in any realistic scenario. But what they're hoping with the tokamak is that they'll be able to use this magnetic bottle to get a continuous burn. That is, to get it up to 150 million degrees Celsius, and then it itself will maintain that temperature after the initial really truly ignition. I think the word ignition is actually a misnomer in this case. It's more like a detonation than an ignition.
Right. Right. And
I was reading, Gordon, that the number of personnel that would be needed, let us say 50 years from now, after we have not solved climate change, we have tritium reactors around the world, they would take 1,000 people compared to fission reactors to operate every month. So fission has 500 personnel in shifts. The tritium reactors would be even more expensive. They would use more water. The tritium would be very, very expensive around the world. And so I was deluded thinking this is going to be better than solar and wind power. But now I'm back to the renewables. But of course, everyone says the renewables are not going to solve our energy needs either. So, we were all deluded by false advertising. But I want to get back to the false advertising of the CTBT, because really, if the United States would sign the CTBT and abide by it, then China and Russia probably would start thinking about it. So this is yet another arms control treaty that the United States is threatening. Our whole arms control regime is now only held up by the NPT regime. And you saw that collapse in August as well. So I'm now thinking, because of Frank's comments, that this whole false advertising also lends a veneer of falsity to the CTBT, because we always say, oh, the CTBT is in practice, we are abiding by it, but not we just can't sign it. We can't ratify it because of the Senate, just as you said. But now I'm wondering if this is all behind the scenes, just a calculated delaying tactic, because the US simply will not disarm. They will not move toward disarmament. That's clear from NATO's strategic concept as well.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I sound indignant because I am indignant, because all these problems are very complicated and they're all connected. And it's hard for people to go from failed arms control treaties to tritium, to fusion, to fission, to going back to, it's just too complicated for everybody. Anyway, I really appreciate that you are here to simplify it for the audience. Frank, did you have any thoughts about the CTBT and the falsity of that arms control?
Well, the CTBT, I heard recently that people at the labs were starting to agitate for resumed nuclear testing because the NIF was not working, and that therefore that threw doubts on the codes. So from that point of view, it's fortunate that finally started to work. But it is a just one correction on one thing you said, Erica, which is Russia actually did ratify the CTBT.
Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah. China has not, right?
China has held back to wait for U.S. to ratify.
Yeah,
they felt there was a bait and switch, and one explanation I've received is in the case of the Chemical Weapons Convention, they felt that the U.S. added conditions after China had ratified, had forced the addition of additional conditions, which weren't there before, and that therefore they wanted to make sure that they knew what they were ratifying by having the U.S. ratify first.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there are maybe 5 countries on the list of required countries that still have not ratified, but I think the U.S. is the most significant.
Yeah.
authority.
Yeah, I think the fundamental problem here is that despite legal obligations under international law to really get rid of their nuclear weapons, which is what the NPT Article 6 requires, they are, and the public are being lied to repeatedly about research which is fundamentally military in nature and fundamentally based on the what's called the stockpile stewardship program. And that means the stockpile of enormously destructive nuclear weapons by the thousands, which are already in existence. The question is, without testing, how can we know that they're still going to work as planned? So we have to do laboratory work, such as this ignition facility, in order to be able to have the means in the laboratory to test whether they're still enormously destructive, so that we can ruin the planet completely if we had to. Now, of course, I'm putting it in a cynical way there, but this is the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that they are not living up to international law obligations to get rid of their nuclear weapons. Despite repeated assurances that that's what they want to do. And so it's hypocrisy, and a very, very dangerous hypocrisy, because, of course, it sets the tone for other countries. And what's even worse in this context is Canada, which always boasts that it never developed nuclear weapons, even though it could have. Canada belongs to NATO, which is an organization that explicitly says they will use nuclear weapons if push comes to shove. They would even be the first to use nuclear weapons under military situations where conventional weapons would not do the job. So what message does this send to the other countries of the world? It says you better get your own nuclear weapons, because NATO says their security, it's essential to have nuclear weapons for that purpose. So the fundamental problem here is that this smokescreen about peaceful fusion energy is simply a way of hiding the emperor's new clothes. It's like the case of the emperor's new clothes. The emperor is naked, but they don't want anybody to know that. So they dress him up in these invisible clothes, which is peaceful nuclear fusion. What's really under those invisible clothes is Armageddon.
Gordon, you're right, but I think the news is, there is some positive news in recent times. I think one could expect a natural reaction by the non-weapon states after 50 years of waiting for the weapon states to get serious about getting rid of their nuclear weapons, saying the hell with it, hell with the non-proliferation treaty. We're going to get our own weapons since that seems to be essential to be safe. But instead, they have organized and are promoting this treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They're doubling down
Correct.
on proliferation because they recognize the danger that weapons, they haven't been seduced by the false security that nuclear, being able to threaten with nuclear weapons brings. They recognize the danger of accidental and nuclear war out of madness, and have doubled down on saying, let's get rid of these things.
I certainly agree with you, Frank. And Erica, I'm sure, is that we in Canada have been trying to get our government to sign that treaty, and they won't sign it because they belong to NORAD and NATO, which are predicated on the continued existence of nuclear weapons. So we're back in a kind of a catch-22 situation. You're absolutely right. The UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the answer, which goes beyond the NPT. But the NATO members won't sign it, and the nuclear weapon states won't sign it. So there's a lot of work to do on behalf of citizenship. Ordinary citizens have got to see through the hype, see through the smoke cloud of peaceful purposes, and realize that underneath that smoke cloud, there's still this enormous potential. And we've got to get our governments to, follow the will of the planet. Really, it's not just the people of the country they're in. It's global security rather than national security.
Can I say something about the arguments that are made by the defenders of NATO, the opposite arguments that you and I make, Gordon, and just, I'm going to give you their arguments really quickly, which is Article 6 says move toward general and complete disarmament. And yes, we have done that since the end of the Cold War. We have moved, as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense told me very convincingly, we've moved from an arsenal of 64,000 weapons around the
Right.
world to approximately 15,500. And they are not willing to move to a world where the United States would not have nuclear weapons. So you know the argument that is made by NATO Secretary General as well, that nuclear weapons are essential, and until there are no nuclear weapons, NATO will continue to have its own arsenal. And the Ukraine crisis has added to that, because there is the perception that if you don't have nuclear weapons, you will be attacked. That's the lesson of Ukraine. And the 1994 Budapest Memorandum had no meaning. So therefore, we should all have nuclear weapons. And the countries that are trying to sign the TPNW are deluded. It is a weak treaty. I'm giving you all their arguments.
I know.
They're very sound. They're strong. They're coherent. And the problem is we just see things very differently. And I want to get back to Frank, because he was reading about nuclear winter just before he came on. And I think they don't understand. They don't understand that the use of just a few tactical weapons between even India and Pakistan would lead to a famine, a global famine, and the collapse of the entire world economy. Frank, do you think that's true? What do we know about nuclear winter that we need to remember?
Well, I mean, nuclear winter is a serious hypothesis, and I recently was able to actually, I mean, but it's been with us for I guess 40 years now,
Mm-hmm.
And it's been largely ignored.
Mm-hmm.
Some people. Academics have been doing good work on it, but it has been largely ignored by the people who work on nuclear policy. I've been trying to change this. In my I guess 2 years ago, I was able to get the Congress to ask the National Academy of Sciences to do a review of it. I hope that will result in it being taken more seriously, and not just dismissed. There are uncertainties, and I expect that the study will point at those uncertainties. But even without nuclear winter, we've seen the disruption from a small non-nuclear war in Ukraine cause famine in Africa.
Mm.
Can you imagine the kind of famine that the world would confront even without a nuclear winter as a
Wait a minute, hold on.
result of the disruption of trade?
Hey, you said something I hadn't heard before. What's this? Something caused famine in Africa?
Yeah, Ukraine can't export its bread basket of the world. So countries in Africa are suffering because the price of food has jumped astronomically. They can't afford grain. So just a small war, like Frank is saying, in the Ukraine war, small conventional war has already created famine.
Yeah.
In Yemen and in Lebanon as well, not just in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm sorry, Frank, I interrupted you.
No. But I was basically finished. I mean, so I was just saying that a large scale war would stop global trade and not just exports of wheat from Ukraine, and there would be even apart from nuclear winter effects, causing crop failures, lots of people would die. I mean, not counting the people who already died from the direct effects of nuclear weapons. When the nuclear winter theory was first broached, I sort of kept my distance from it because I said, if all those cities are burning, what more do I need to oppose nuclear war? But I think it has. The countries that are now promoting the core countries that promoting this treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons happen to be almost entirely in the southern hemisphere.
Mm.
And apparently this nuclear winter idea is salient for them. I mean, that even non-target countries would be enormously affected. As I said, it would already be true because of the trade effects.
Yeah.
I'm a little puzzled if I could ask a technical question there. I had heard that that nuclear winter would affect the northern hemisphere, but not the southern hemisphere. So why would the southern hemisphere people be more worried than we would?
No, you're right. The main climate effects would be in the northern hemisphere. But I think that there would be some effects in the southern hemisphere as well.
I'd like to return to this question of the logic that Erica was talking about with regard to NATO's logic, that as long as, yes, we want to get rid of nuclear weapons, but until we do get rid of nuclear weapons, we have to have them. They're essential. That's almost like an Alice in Wonderland argument, I'm reminded of a law that apparently was on the books in New York for a while before people noticed it. It said that when two trains meet, each shall stop till the other passes. Well, this is, of course, nonsensical. But if I'm not mistaken, the atmospheric test ban treaty, the partial test ban treaty, came about only after there was a unilateral cessation of testing in America as a result of public outcry about the effects of fallout, followed by a unilateral cessation of testing by Russia, and only later followed by a signing of the partial test ban treaty. So in other words, this logic that you can't be the first to make a move because you can't trust the other side we already have examples historically that show that's, in fact, somebody has to make the first move. Now, going to zero, of course, is not a likely thing on either side, but somebody's got to be serious about putting a muscle behind the rhetoric. I mean, they have, even in January of this year, the leaders of the 5 acknowledged nuclear weapon states, the 5 official nuclear weapon states mentioned in the NPT, made the statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. Well, that's a fine rhetorical statement, but if that's the case, why is it essential to have these nuclear arsenals? So I do think that we as citizens have to counteract this kind of Alice in Wonderland logic that really gets us nowhere. And really, as Frank says, and I certainly agree, it's the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that should guide our efforts in that regard.
Well, as long as the U.S. tells the NATO allies that they cannot sign the TPNW behind the scenes, then that TPNW treaty is not going to go anywhere, which is why I'm working toward 2026 and the 2026 meeting of the parties to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, because that treaty needs to be strengthened. And they in a way reached near agreement. It was just on Russia that they could not agree. So what was interesting was behind the scenes, they were talking about planks that they talked about in 2010, strengthening the CTBT that we've talked about, moratorium on above ground testing, all these we all know what the steps are. And it was interesting that in August, just a few months ago, there was a little bit of unanimity more. And so that's what I'm working toward is 2026, because I don't see that Canada will sign the TPNW because it is a member of NATO. And I don't see that Canada will pull out of NATO. So if we're in NATO, then let's at least have a seat at the table and talk about what we think is important, which is spearheading disarmament.
Well, on the other hand, I think Canada could play a role within NATO to cause a bit of a mini rebellion against this really abominable policy that NATO has. The statement Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was the only political leader that I'm aware of who publicly spoke out against the insanity of the NATO policy on nuclear weapons. He's also the one in 1978, before the UN General Assembly, that is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who gave his strategy of suffocation speech, which was that if we're serious about getting rid of nuclear weapons, then one component of that has to be a strategy of suffocation, choking off the vital oxygen on which the nuclear arms race feeds, and that includes the primary nuclear explosive materials. We shouldn't be producing nuclear explosives, plutonium and highly enriched uranium, if we want to have a nuclear weapons-free world. Unfortunately, in the absence of the will to proceed to the abolition of nuclear weapons, or to show goodwill in that regard, the opposite is happening, that we're getting more and more examples of how it may be advantageous to all countries to acquire their own nuclear weapons. And that means any conflict anywhere in the world could turn into a nuclear war.
Well, we've actually seen, in the case of the Ukraine war, the aggressive use of nuclear threats. Putin has basically limited what NATO can do by threatening to resort to nuclear weapons, and so we are seeing the downsides of deterrence. And this is deterrence of an alliance, and I think that NATO should draw some lessons from that. I actually am. I'm glad you're talking about Canada. I think that that there are other NATO non-nuclear weapon states that are where there's. I think the movement for a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is actually starting debate in Germany and in the Netherlands and in Belgium, and I hope you manage to start a debate in Canada. And in fact, the NATO insists that it's a nuclear alliance.
Yes.
But in fact, some countries have opted out of the nuclear part.
Right.
Denmark and Norway in particular.
Yes, Denmark and Sweden and Finland, which is thinking about joining NATO, doesn't want to have nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. Neither does Canada. So there will be a debate in NATO, I'm sure. Well, we've lost.
I'd like to remind people of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. They described possession of nuclear weapons as a form of addiction. And they said, the addict is not always able to kick the habit by himself, no matter how often he says, I got to stop drinking, or I got to stop shooting up. Nevertheless, you really need to have like a circle of friends, a intervention, a circle that is trusted, that can help the addict to kick the habit. And I see the middle powers, Canada and other countries that do belong to NATO. They could do the world a service by really publicly questioning the nuclear policies of NATO and the USA. In a friendly way, not in a combative or dismissive or condemning way, but the point is that these problems have got to be recognized before they can be solved. I'm a math teacher, and you can't solve a problem unless you know what the problem is. And unfortunately, too many people in the world do not know what the problem is. So leaders could play a very helpful role for the whole world by dragging these questions out into the public domain, and rather than disguising a fundamentally military project like the Lawrence Livermore Lab experiment, disguising it as a peaceful energy thing when in fact it's a military maintenance project.
Well, we do have to restart the debate over nuclear weapons policy. I think people assume that the problem went away with the end of the Cold War,
right,
and the reductions that have now stopped and in fact may reverse.
Exactly, go back up again.
Well, I mean, if you're an adept, they always say friends help. I agree, but you have to decide you want to quit yourself. If you're addicted to cigarettes or alcohol, you have to make the decision. Similar, the US has to make the decision that it is going to get rid of or at least downsize its nuclear arsenal. And that's why policies like no first use are promising, because if we could get the United States to at least agree to no first use in the wake of Putin's threats, because it's exactly right that deterrence has now been seriously undermined. How can you believe in nuclear deterrence? How can you spend billions of dollars on weapons that are essentially not credible? You can't use them. We can't, they're not solving this crisis with Russia. So I think deterrence is being undermined slowly and surely in the United States, people who think about this are questioning the credibility of nuclear weapons. My worry is that nations around the world will weigh the cost of nuclear are very expensive and let's go for bioweapons. Let's just get ourselves a small little bioweapons arsenal, much, much cheaper and also very threatening. And so that's what I'm worried about. So that gets to the essential question, which is why do we want to kill each other so much over these small issues? I don't understand it. And I guess just going into the Christmas peace season, my wondering is, what is it about actually men that they're so warlike, so bent on? We all watch the soccer final. Why are we doing this? Why are we so competitive? And so that gets into more deeper questions about human nature and why we kill each other. I can't answer those questions.
No. Well, it certainly is fundamental. And I think that I think this is the really fundamental question. Is there, you could couch it in different ways. Is there intelligent life on Earth? Or is the human race really sufficiently geared towards evolving towards sustainability? Because it's really, it's like in a cultural terms, in terms of politics and culture and awareness, we have a lot of global awareness, but not sufficient global will. And if we could bridge the gap between our awareness and our will, I think we could make progress on this. But it's almost like an evolutionary leap that speaking societally, that human society has got to make that leap to a global consciousness that really sees global security as the goal and not national security only.
You said something, Erica, that kind of puzzles me, because you said, how could you believe in deterrence? I think right now it's easier to believe in deterrence than it was before this Ukraine war started, because I think Putin has deterred the U.S. The U.S. would have easily used their regular army to attack Russia and defend Ukraine. I think Putin really demonstrated the extreme power of his deterrence. And
I agree, Matt. I agree that on the surface, it looks like deterrence worked, and that Russia and NATO have deterred each other. But it also, underneath it, has undermined deterrence. We're now asking, is it right for two men, Putin and Biden, rational decision makers, to be able to blow up the whole world and to use these things? That doesn't seem rational to me. And so it's being undermined by asking questions about miscalculation and misperception, misunderstanding, and all of the consequences, which is why we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we nearly went to the brink there. We were nearly in an accidental war. So any day now we could have also another accidental problem. So there's two sides. Yes, deterrence is strengthened by the Ukraine example, but it's also weakened because now we're really seeing how it actually works, and it makes us worried.
Well, Frank's revelation about what went on behind the scenes with regard to the weapons labs back in 1993 when they stopped testing. Okay, well, give us the goods, give us the money so we can do something else. Don't cut our funds back. Just give us the same money that we would have got if we were testing, and we'll sort of grumble and make do with that. And now they are trying to argue for resumed testing, as we hear, but in a kind of a similar way, I think that we have to realize that Biden himself was on the verge of announcing a no first use policy, and it was these weapons labs and their cohorts that really said, no, 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 Mr. President, you mustn't do that. You mustn't do
Mhm.
that. It reminds me also of the Reykjavik meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan, where they were just on the verge of really doing it, really saying, okay, let's go to zero. And the advisors on both sides, I think, just about
Mhm.
freaked out. So what we have created, we humans, we've created machinery, and I'm not talking about the weapons, but the actual political machinery
Mhm.
and the infrastructure, the military-industrial complex, and all the billions and billions of dollars invested in that. That you have created a tremendous force for not changing the status quo with regard to weaponry, and that's a major problem as well. This is why public outcry is so important, because the only thing that can balance the voices inside the government machinery is voices from outside the government machinery. And without those outside voices, which we're not seeing today in sufficient numbers, remember the million person march in New York City with huge puppets
Mhm.
against nuclear weapons? That really had an effect. And we're not seeing that today. I think that people misunderstand the power that they actually have. They have a lot more power than they think they have.
Frank, do you remember the Global Partnership Program where the United States and Canada gave billions of dollars to Russia to pay for their nuclear scientists so that they would not work on nuclear weapons? Could we do the same with the United States? Because couldn't we just give Livermore billions of dollars, say, okay, here, you have some money, go and do it. But as long as, what I'm not being facetious, but what I'm saying is a partnership, a global partnership program so that Americans would have jobs, but they would not necessarily be building nuclear weapons.
We do need a counterbalance to what Gordon has called the military-industrial complex, which is what it is. And we did have a counterbalance, as he said, in the early 1980s when we had this grassroots uprising against the nuclear arms race. And so, the lesson, but then people went away because they assumed the Cold War was over, the danger was gone. Now we have this unbalanced political situation in which those who represent, who have nuclear weapons facilities in their states and their districts, are the only people left on the field, and they're shoveling money into this system. And we need to develop a balance again, a counterforce again. And a group of us are trying to mobilize the physicists to get involved again. We've created the Physicist Coalition for nuclear threat reduction. We have about 1,000 physicists now. And we're trying to now organize them to educate Congress, people who are not part of the military-industrial congressional complex, to understand the issues well enough so that they can debate the issues and create a counterbalance.
And here in Canada, of course, we watch what you're doing in the United States, and we learn from that as well. So we don't have an association of physicists, but we do have natural scientists and social scientists in the international pugwash movement, which is, so Canada has an affiliate, the Canadian Pugwash Group, but the international movement has national affiliations all around the world. And I believe they're going to be holding a conference in Qatar in February on nuclear risks and nuclear dangers.
I'd like to ask you about that, Frank. You said that you and some other people are trying to restart the movement. Well, great. And because of your prestige as a nuclear scientist, I think you will be listened to, a little bit. Nobody really will, you're not going to change the whole world by yourself. But, I think that Erica mentioned the Pugwash thing. The thing about Pugwash is it brought together nuclear scientists everywhere. And now, of course, Pugwash includes a lot of people who are not nuclear scientists. But I wonder if your effort, which is, I gather, confined to the U.S., would there be any point in attempting again to rekindle relationships among nuclear scientists in all of these other countries? So if you could have a list of the 20 or 50 most prominent nuclear scientists in all of the countries that are nuclear weapons states, that would mean something. I think it would mean more than having each country do it separately. Has any thought been given to that?
Yes, we started engaging. I gave a talk at CERN, the European Center on Nuclear Research, and we're going to have a meeting in next fall in Trieste to gather people together to see whether we can become an international movement.
What about Chinese? What about Pakistani? What about Russian nuclear scientists? I doubt that any of them would dare think of forming any kind of relationship with the nuclear scientists in the U.S.
We do have a webinar going on with the Chinese counterparts, trying to keep that open. And with Russia, it's really the situation with Ukraine has been so destructive that we don't really have a dialogue going on with Russia at the moment.
I was looking at the Russian Pugwash site, and it's very rich with scientists. It is translated from Russian into English. So I'll send you that link. But it's very good, and it shows you that there are a lot of scientists in Russia who are muffled right now, who cannot say anything. But behind the scenes, they're seeing the war crimes on the ground. They're listening to the Russian mothers, seeing their children coming back in body bags and dead. And so they're thinking about this too. And I'm sure that if you could reach out to them in the United States, maybe you could reach out to China and to Russia. That would be very helpful, more helpful than reaching out to Canada, because Canada, we're already on board. We're already supportive.
Thank you. Please do send me that link.
I will.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I do feel that the time is ripe because just as Frank indicated a moment ago, is that we have seen this reassuring decline in dismantling of thousands of warheads and so on, but this has created a false sense of security and put people back to sleep again. And the modern generation does not have the instinctive fear of nuclear weapons it's become a buzzword that has little content to people who were born in this century, for example. And I think that there really needs to be efforts to reignite a kind of an actual movement, both national and international, that will act as a countervailing voice to the voice of the establishment, the military industrial complex, as we call it, that really has a kind of free rein right now. They're able to sort of wield their influence without fear of much opposition. And even getting away with this kind of recent falsification of the results of that fusion breakthrough and couching it as if a wonderful gift to humanity, that we're going to have unlimited energy just around the corner, thanks to our work on thermonuclear weapons, which they don't say thanks to that, but these are things that we really, the younger generation has to pick up on this, and I think we have to pass the torch to them with full, not only the torch, but the kind of knowledge and information and insight that they need to carry that battle forward.
Well, the problem is you talk to them, and probably Erica knows better than I do because I'm not teaching anymore, but when I was teaching and I talked to my students about it, they would say, well, look, I mean, we've gone this far, many, many, many decades, and nothing has happened. So far, so good. So your concerns are really, you're exaggerating, nobody would really do that. Nobody would do that.
They also, I want to mention, they reject us, the elders, because I teach thousands of students. I have thousands of students because they all want to learn about Ukraine and nuclear issues. They want to learn these things. But when I talk to them, they're angry at the older generation because we got everything. they get low minimum wage. They can't afford a house. They say to me, I'm thinking about my education. I got to get through next year. And then I got the climate crisis too, right? So what have you given me? What have you given me? A whole nest of problems. And I apologize on behalf of everyone, but there's nothing, they reject us in many ways.
But now you say your students do take it seriously, though, that it is a problem.
Take it seriously, but they reject our ways.
My students would say it's not a problem. Forget about it. Worry about something real.
Well, I have been, when I was teaching, I've retired from teaching now, but I give many talks. And when I did teach classes at Vanier, I was invited in by other teachers to address their classes on nuclear issues. And I got a lot of students coming up to me and thanking me very sincerely for providing insight. It really opened their eyes. I think that my personal belief is that a lot of the mystification, see, this is getting off topic perhaps a little bit, but math phobia combined with science phobia. People say, I'm no expert. How can I even have an opinion on this? I've got other things to worry about. If the thing can be presented in a way that's understandable to them, they appreciate it. That's been my experience. And I've been thanked many times by young people. I don't try and tell them what to do or what to think, but I present the problem as accurately as I can and answer the questions as best I can. I do think that that's the starting point. And again, I go back to my mathematical analogy. In mathematics, or in life for that matter, you don't solve a problem by running away from it. You have to understand the problem. And if you present it that way, look, there's no point in getting emotional about this right now. You can get emotional about it later. But right now, the problem is just understanding what the problem is. And then you figure out what we can do about it, because human ingenuity is sometimes tremendous. And young people have amazing ideas which come to the surface that you would never expect.
People talk about the 70 odd years we've had without a nuclear war, and therefore we shouldn't worry. But they don't know about all the near misses we
right.
And that the control of the future of the world is in the hands of irrational people like Trump and Putin. That this is an unacceptable situation. It can't be allowed to continue because we will have a nuclear war, and it will it could destroy civilization.
Well, guys, we've certainly covered more than fusion today. I think we've gone into what is really where we need to focus, because fusion is a serious deception, I think. But it's just part of the whole thing of being lied to about things that we should be on top of. And if we are good citizens, we need to know more. Everybody needs to just talk more about it and get clearer about what our problem is, to use your math analogy. So we've done it. Thank you very much today.
Thank you, Meta.
Thank you, Meta. And Erica, please give Doug Roche my best regards.
I will.
Yes.
Project Save the World produces these shows, and this is episode 536. Watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. You can share information there about 6 global issues, too. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click to subscribe.